Carpets are surprisingly hard to get right in 3D. I recently posted these renders to the Blender subreddit, and people asked how it looked so real. And although it takes up just a small portion of the image, one of the biggest reasons is the carpet. Now, a lot of people just slap a carpet texture on a plane and think it's sorted. But if we apply that to the images I've shown you, this is what it looks like. CG is heavily optimized for hard surface and solid objects, and carpets are made of thousands of tiny strands, which is why textures never look quite right. They have issues with tiling, flat edges, and lack of depth. Using a hair particle system technique gives a huge amount of flexibility over how a carpet can look. First, we set up the geometry node system. Add an empty hair curve object to your floor plane. We'll use a custom curve to instance across the floor, so just create something simple like this. This is the node setup we're going to be creating. First, add your curve object as a geometry input. You might need to scale it up or down depending on its size. The next node we'll add is a generate hair curves node. The generate hair curves node group doesn't have a curve input, so we're going to have to do some surgery. The node group will be locked by default, so we need to make it a local user. Now press tab to go inside the node. All we need to do now is add a new group input socket for the custom curve, then route that from the group input into the resample curve input. Surgery complete. The other thing this node needs is a UV map attribute and a surface input of both object type and geometry type. You can convert from object type to geometry type using a geometry input. Now dial in the settings so you have an even spread of curves over the entire surface. These will be your guide curves. Now it's time for variation. Find any random textures you have. I use 2 layers of variation, a very subtle rotation of the fibers using this setup, and a bigger flattening of some areas of the carpet, which makes the carpet look more used. I use the axis input to target the z-axis for flattening. The images you use don't really matter too much. Just make sure they have some amount of randomness of values. Now that we have the guide curves, we can use them to create the rest of the carpet. Use an interpolate hair curves node. The geometry input should be the curves we've just created. Then the surface and UV maps will use the same inputs as the generate node. Use the density slider to fill out your carpet depending on its size. Mine used around 80,000, but that can be quite heavy, so you can use this node setup to switch between 2 detail levels when you don't want to use the high density version. Finally, use a frizz hair curves node to give variation to each strand. For rendering, we need to use a hair curve profile to set its radius, then store named attribute to store an attribute for our material to read from. Now just set your material to the new carpet material we will create next. The problem is, carpet fibers don't behave quite like hair, but also don't look correct with a normal principled shader either. So we have to use a mix of a hair shader and a principled shader. To get the colors right, we'll use a few different techniques to vary each individual strand. First, we can use an image texture and a color ramp to define each individual color we want. This will give us a range of different colors. Then we can use a wave texture along each individual strand to give them a slight indication of weaving. And this gives us the final result, a carpet that looks real enough for any interior scene. If you found this video helpful, check out my work on my website and subscribe for more videos soon about other ways to make realistic looking renders.